Today, I've got 3 stories about people who became completely convinced they had finally figured everything out. They had a plan. They thought it was clever. They thought it would fix the one problem standing in their way. And for a little while, some of them even believed it was working. But they were wrong. Because in each of these stories, one decision that was supposed to make life easier ended up creating a much bigger problem, and someone else was left dealing with the consequences. So if you like strange, dark, and unsettling true stories told like you're hearing them from someone sitting right next to you, you're in the right place. That's pretty much all we do around here. And since we're here, please bring the like button a nice warm cup of coffee, tell them it's completely safe to drink, and then quietly replace the sugar with salt. Also, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. All right, let's get into it. A farm so isolated. At night, there are no porch lights in the distance, no cars passing on a nearby road, and no neighbors close enough to hear you call for help. There is only open farmland, a line of dark trees, and your own house sitting in the middle of it all. That was Hinterkaifeck. In 1922, Hinterkaifeck was a small farm in rural Bavaria, about 40 miles north of Munich. The farmhouse, barn, and livestock areas were connected, so every creak in the barn and movement above the ceiling seemed to travel through the whole building. The man who ran the farm was 63-year-old Andreas Gruber. Andreas had spent most of his life working the land and caring for animals. He knew the sounds of wind, rats, and restless cattle. And that matters, because near the end of March, Andreas noticed something he could not explain. One morning, he went outside and saw footprints in the snow. They began at the edge of the forest and crossed the open ground toward Hinterkaifeck. At first, that was strange, but not terrifying. Maybe a neighbor had stopped by. Maybe a traveler had cut across the property. So Andreas followed the tracks. They led directly toward the farm buildings. Then he searched for the tracks going back. There were none. No second trail returning to the trees. No prints circling the house and continuing down the road. As far as Andreas could tell, someone had walked out of the forest, crossed the snow, and entered his property. But that person had never walked away. Andreas searched the sheds and barn. He looked for anyone who might be hiding nearby. He found nothing. If this had been the only strange thing that happened, he probably would have dismissed it. Snow can be deceptive. But then Andreas found a newspaper on the property. It came from Munich. Nobody in the family had bought it. Nobody remembered bringing it home. And Hinterkaifeck was not beside a busy street where a newspaper might simply blow into the yard. Somebody had carried it there. Around the same time, one of the house keys disappeared. Everyone loses keys. But think about how Andreas must have seen it. First, footprints came from the forest and did not go back. Then a newspaper appeared that belonged to no one. Then a key to the farm vanished. And after that, Andreas began hearing footsteps in the attic. Not random tapping, not the light scratching of an animal. According to accounts later connected to the case, he believed the sounds were heavy and deliberate. Someone walking above the family while they were inside the house. So Andreas went up to look. He searched the attic. There was nobody there. But the place had already frightened someone else. The family's previous maid had left months earlier. She reportedly said the house was haunted because she kept hearing strange noises and could no longer stand being there. At the time, that probably sounded like superstition. Old houses shift in cold weather. Loose boards knock in the wind. Small animals crawl into spaces people cannot see. But now Andreas was hearing something too. And here's the part that always gets me. He apparently told people about these things, but he did not leave the farm, and he did not immediately bring in the police. He stayed. Maybe he believed there had to be a simple explanation. Or maybe Andreas was exactly the kind of stubborn farmer who thought, this is my property. If someone is hiding here, I will find them myself. Andreas did not live alone. His 72-year-old wife, Cecilia, lived there with him. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, also lived on the farm, along with her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. So every night, 5 people went to sleep inside that connected farmhouse and barn. And somewhere above them, Andreas believed he could hear movement. Just picture lying in bed there. Outside your window is complete darkness. Beyond the yard is the forest where the footprints began. You know, a key is missing. Then, just as everything becomes quiet, you hear a floorboard creak above your ceiling. Then another. A slow step across the attic floor. You wait. The sound stops. You go upstairs with a lamp, search every corner, and find absolutely nothing. Then, on Friday, March 31st, a new maid arrived at Hinterkaifeck. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She was in her mid-40s, and this was supposed to be the beginning of a new job. Her sister accompanied her to the farm, helped her settle in, and then left. Maria had no connection to the strange newspaper. She knew nothing about the missing key, and there is no reason to believe she understood why the previous maid had been so afraid of the house. She had simply arrived for work. That evening, 6 people were inside Hinterkaifeck: the grandfather, the grandmother, their daughter, 2 young children, and a maid who had been there only a few hours. From the outside, the farm would have looked completely normal. The animals were in their stalls. The buildings were dark. The surrounding fields were quiet. But sometime that night, 4 members of the family left the living area and entered the barn. We do not know what they heard. We do not know what drew them out there. We only know they appear to have gone one after another. And someone was waiting for them in the dark. Now, before we get to what happened in that barn, you need to understand something about the people living at Hinterkaifeck, because from the outside, this looked like a quiet farming family. But inside that house, things were much more complicated. Andreas Gruber was the head of the household. He was known as a hard man, stubborn, controlling, not especially warm. His wife, Cecilia, was older and had spent years working beside him on the farm. Their adult daughter, Victoria Gabriel, also lived there. Victoria had been married, but her husband had died during World War I, leaving her a widow with children. She was still relatively young, in her mid-30s, and by most accounts, she was the person who kept much of the household running. She sang in the church choir. She handled money. She helped manage the farm. And she had a complicated relationship with one of the neighbors. His name was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Lorenz lived nearby and had known the family for years. At some point, he and Victoria became romantically involved. That alone would not have been unusual. But then Victoria became pregnant. In 1919, she gave birth to a son named Joseph. And almost immediately, there was a question hanging over that child. Who was Joseph's father? Lorenz apparently believed, at least for a time, that the boy might be his. There were discussions about marriage. There were arguments. Money changed hands. And then things between Lorenz and Victoria fell apart. But the situation was even darker than a broken relationship. Years earlier, Andreas and Victoria had been convicted of having an incestuous relationship. That is not rumor added by people decades later. Authorities had actually investigated them, and both had faced legal consequences. So when Joseph was born, there were people who suspected that Lorenz might not be the father at all. Some believed Andreas could have been. Now, that does not tell us who killed the family. But it does tell us something important. Hinterkaifeck was not simply a peaceful farmhouse where 6 completely ordinary people happened to be attacked by a stranger. There were grudges. There were secrets. There were relationships that had gone bad. And there were people in the surrounding community who knew far more about the Gruber family than the family probably wanted them to know. Lorenz, in particular, remained connected to Hinterkaifeck even after his relationship with Victoria ended. He lived close enough to know the property. He knew the family. He knew their routines. And because of the dispute over Joseph, he had a personal history with them. Keep that in mind. But there is something else you need to keep in mind too. The strange activity at the farm did not start after the murders. It started before. Andreas had already seen the footprints. He had already found the newspaper. He had already noticed the missing key. He had already heard noises above the family's heads. That creates a really disturbing possibility. What if the person who eventually attacked the family did not simply walk onto the property on March 31st? What if that person had been watching them? What if they had been learning the farm? Or worse, what if they had already found a way inside? Think about the layout of a place like Hinterkaifeck. This was not a modern house with neat hallways and locked interior doors. The residence connected directly to agricultural spaces. There were storage areas, lofts, animal stalls, hay, tools, and parts of the building where someone could potentially move around without immediately being seen. A person familiar with farms would know that, and someone who had access to the attic could hear almost everything happening below. People talking, doors opening, someone leaving for town, someone going to bed, a child crying, the family's daily rhythm. That is why those attic noises matter so much. Maybe they were nothing. Maybe an animal really was moving around up there. Maybe an old building was making old building noises. But after what happened next, investigators and later researchers could not stop wondering about another possibility. Someone may have been hiding on the property before the killings. And if that is true, then the Gruber family may have spent their final days doing chores, eating meals, and going to sleep without realizing that another person was somewhere inside the same structure. Now add Maria Baumgartner into this. Maria arrived on March 31st to become the new maid. This was supposed to be a fresh start for her. She came with very little connection to the family drama. She had not been part of Victoria's relationship with Lorenz. She had nothing to do with Joseph's paternity. She had not been around for the previous arguments. And unlike the former maid, Maria apparently did not have time to become frightened by the place. She arrived that afternoon. Her sister helped her get settled. Then her sister left. That detail becomes heartbreaking when you think about it. Maria's sister was probably one of the last outsiders to see the household alive. She walked away from Hinterkaifeck thinking Maria was beginning a new job. She had no reason to believe she had just left her sister in a house where something terrible was already in motion. As evening came, the family settled into the usual routine. The animals needed attention. Food had to be prepared. The children were there. The new maid was getting used to the house. Nothing suggests that anyone was running for help. Nothing suggests that the family believed an attack was moments away. And yet sometime after dark, something changed. We cannot know exactly what happened first. That is one of the most frustrating parts of this case. But investigators later believed that 4 members of the household somehow ended up in the barn area. Andreas, his wife, Cecilia, Victoria, and 7-year-old Cecilia. Not all at once. Apparently one after another. Maybe somebody heard an animal making noise. Maybe someone called for help. Maybe one person went out, did not come back, and the next person went looking. We simply do not know. But whoever was in that barn had one enormous advantage. The family did not seem to understand what was happening until it was too late. And that raises one question that has never really gone away. If the killer was a stranger, how did that person move around Hinterkaifeck so confidently? How did they get close enough to control the situation? And if the killer was not a stranger, then maybe the most frightening thing about those footprints was not that someone had come to the farm. Maybe it was that Andreas had been searching for an intruder when he should have been looking much closer to home. By the time darkness settled over Hinterkaifeck on March 31st, there were 6 people inside the farm, and as far as anyone knows, none of them had any idea they were about to die. That is what makes the next part so unsettling. There was no sign of a struggle spreading across the property. No evidence that the family tried to flee in different directions. No indication that neighbors heard screaming or saw someone running through the fields. Instead, it looks like the killer managed to deal with the family quietly, one person at a time. Investigators later believed the first 4 victims were killed in the barn. Exactly how they got there is still unknown. Andreas may have heard something among the animals. That would make sense. If you own livestock and something sounds wrong in the middle of the night, you go check it. You do not call the police. You grab a lantern and walk into the barn. So maybe Andreas went first. Picture him leaving the warmth of the house, stepping into the connected barn area, expecting to find a restless cow or a loose animal. Instead, someone was waiting for him. The weapon used in the murders was believed to have been a heavy farm tool, something similar to a mattock. A tool with enough weight to kill very quickly if the attacker struck from behind or caught the victim by surprise. Andreas was hit in the head. He went down. Now the killer had a problem. There were still 5 people in the house. If they all came running at once, everything could fall apart. But that apparently did not happen. The next person entered the barn alone. It may have been Andreas's wife, Cecilia. Maybe Andreas had been gone too long. Maybe she called his name and got no answer. Maybe she walked out to see what he was doing. She was killed there too. Then Victoria came. Then 7-year-old Cecilia. 4 members of the family appear to have entered that same area one after another, and all 4 were attacked. That sequence is not absolutely proven, but their bodies were discovered together in the barn, and the circumstances strongly suggested that the killer had somehow drawn them into the same place without alerting the others soon enough. That is incredibly difficult to do. Think about it. After the first attack, the killer has to stay calm. He has to avoid making enough noise to alarm the house. He has to know where the next person is likely to come from. And every time someone enters, he has to stop them before they can scream, run, or fight their way back inside. That is not the behavior of someone who panicked during a burglary. It feels controlled, deliberate, and possibly familiar. Once 4 people were dead in the barn, only 2 were left. Maria, the new maid, and 2-year-old Joseph. They were still inside the living quarters. Maria had arrived only hours earlier. There is no reason to think she understood what was happening outside. Maybe she had already gone to bed. Maybe she heard something and assumed the family was still working. Whatever the case, the killer eventually entered the house. Maria was found in her bedroom. She had also been killed with blows to the head. Then there was Joseph, the youngest person at Hinterkaifeck. He was 2 years old. He was found dead in his cot. And that detail changes the entire feel of the crime. Because if this had started as a confrontation with Andreas, or an argument with Victoria, or a robbery that suddenly went wrong, the attacker still made a conscious decision to enter a room and kill a toddler. There was no practical reason for Joseph to be a threat. He could not identify anyone in court. He could not stop the killer. So whoever did this did not simply want to attack one adult. He wanted everyone in that household gone. When police later examined the bodies, one detail involving 7-year-old Cecilia was especially disturbing. Evidence suggested she may not have died immediately. Investigators reportedly found that she had pulled out clumps of her own hair, something they believed may have happened while she was badly injured and still conscious. It is one of the hardest details in the case to hear, because it means that after the attack, there may have been a period when that little girl was still alive in the barn, and nobody came to help her. By the end of the night, all 6 people at Hinterkaifeck were dead. Andreas, his wife, Victoria, 7-year-old Cecilia, 2-year-old Joseph, and Maria, the woman who had arrived for work that very afternoon. Now, normally, this is the point in a murder story where the killer runs. You would expect someone to grab money, disappear into the woods, reach a train station, or put as much distance as possible between himself and 6 bodies. Especially in a place like Hinterkaifeck. Once daylight came, people would eventually notice. A child would miss school. The family would miss church. Someone would come to the farm. Every hour the killer remained there increased the risk of being caught. So the obvious assumption is that sometime during the night, whoever killed the Grubers left the property. Maybe they went back toward the forest. Maybe those missing tracks finally appeared once the snow began to melt. Maybe by sunrise, Hinterkaifeck was simply a silent farm filled with dead people. But that is not what investigators came to believe. Because when people began approaching the property over the next several days, they noticed little things that did not make sense. The animals were not starving. Someone appeared to have been feeding them. There were signs that food inside the house had been eaten. Smoke was reportedly seen coming from the chimney. And even though the Gruber family was dead, the farm did not seem completely abandoned. Someone was still taking care of it. Which means there is a very real possibility that after killing 6 people, the murderer did not run into the night. He stayed. He walked through their house. He ate their food. He fed their animals. And for the next several days, while visitors came and went outside, the person who had murdered the entire household may have still been living at Hinterkaifeck. The next morning, April 1st, the sun came up over Hinterkaifeck, and from the road, the farm probably looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The buildings were still there. The cattle were still inside. Nothing had burned down. No windows were smashed. There was no body lying out in the yard. No desperate message nailed to a door. Nothing that would make somebody passing by stop and think, something terrible happened here last night. But 6 people were dead. 4 of them were lying in the barn. Maria was dead inside the house. 2-year-old Joseph was dead in his bed. And for the next several days, something incredibly strange happened. Hinterkaifeck kept functioning. Now, the first sign that something was wrong was actually pretty ordinary. 7-year-old Cecilia did not show up for school. That was unusual. But kids get sick. Families have emergencies. Nobody immediately thinks her entire family has been murdered. So the day continued. Later, a coffee salesman came to the farm. He approached the house expecting to do business with the family, but nobody came out to meet him. He knocked. Nothing. He waited. Still nothing. At some point, he left. And you have to imagine how close this man may have been to the truth. He was standing outside a building containing 6 murder victims. He may have been only a wall or a doorway away from them, but he had absolutely no reason to know that. And here is where things begin to get really uncomfortable. The farm did not look abandoned. The livestock were still alive. Cattle do not understand that the people who own them have been murdered. They still need food. They still need water. They still need to be milked and cared for. If nobody had been tending to those animals, it should have become obvious pretty quickly. But later observations suggested that someone had been caring for them. Think about that for a second. If the murders happened Friday night, then by Saturday morning, the killer had every reason in the world to be far away. But somebody appears to have gotten up and done farm chores. Someone moved through the same property where 6 people had just been killed and fed the animals as though it were another normal morning at Hinterkaifeck. And the strangest part is that this was not just a few hours after the murders. Days started passing. On Sunday, April 2nd, the Gruber family failed to appear at church. Victoria was involved with the local church community, so their absence was noticed. But again, it was not enough to trigger immediate panic. Maybe somebody was sick. Maybe something had happened on the farm. In a rural community, people sometimes disappeared into their work for a day or two. So Hinterkaifeck remained quiet. Then came Monday. A postman approached the property with mail. He did what he normally did. And again, no member of the Gruber family appeared. By now, several different people had come close to the farm since Friday night. None of them had seen Andreas. None had seen his wife. None had seen Victoria. None had seen either of the children. And nobody had seen Maria, the new maid. 6 people had effectively vanished at the same time. But the farm itself still did not seem dead. There were reports that smoke had been seen coming from the chimney after the murders. Food inside the house appeared to have been eaten. Bread was reportedly consumed. Meat appears to have been cut. And the animals continued receiving care. Those details are important because they suggest something much more disturbing than a killer simply coming onto the property, committing the murders, and escaping through the woods. Somebody may have stayed. And if that is what happened, just try to picture what that means. At some point, after killing the family, this person would have walked from the barn into the house. Maybe he washed his hands. Maybe he sat at the kitchen table. Maybe he found bread. Maybe he cut himself something to eat. Around him were the possessions of people who had been alive only hours earlier. Their coats, their dishes, their beds, the children's things, and somewhere nearby were their bodies. Then night came again. Where did he sleep? Did he use one of their beds? Did he go back into the attic? Did he simply sit awake inside the house listening for someone coming up the road? We do not know, and that uncertainty is part of what makes Hinterkaifeck so disturbing. Because whoever did this does not appear to have been behaving like someone terrified of being caught. He seems almost comfortable. Then, on Tuesday, April 4th, another visitor arrived. His name was Albert Hoffner. He was a mechanic who had been scheduled to repair an engine at the farm. Hoffner arrived in the morning and expected somebody to meet him. Nobody did. So he called out. No response. He tried to find Andreas. Nothing. But Hoffner had come there to do a job, and apparently he figured the family was busy somewhere else on the property. So he started working, and he remained at Hinterkaifeck for hours. Just think about how bizarre that is. A man is standing on the property repairing machinery while 6 murdered people are lying only a short distance away. He is using tools, making noise, walking around. And if the killer was still there, then the killer could have been listening to every second of it. Hoffner later said that when he arrived, certain doors were closed or locked, and he did not go searching through the residence. He simply finished the repair and eventually left. He had spent hours at the scene of one of Germany's most infamous murders without realizing that a crime had even occurred. But by that afternoon, people in the area were finally becoming concerned. The family had not been seen for days. Cecilia had missed school. Nobody had appeared at church. Visitors had received no answer. Something was clearly wrong. One of the neighbors who became involved was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the same Lorenz who had once been involved with Victoria, the same man whose relationship with the Gruber family had become complicated over little Joseph. Lorenz gathered 2 other men, Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel, and together they headed toward Hinterkaifeck to find out what was going on. As they approached the farm, there still was no dramatic sign of what they were about to discover. No one came running outside. No voice called from a window. The place was simply quiet. They began searching. Then they entered the barn, and under a layer of hay, they found the bodies. Andreas was there. His wife was there. Victoria was there. And 7-year-old Cecilia was there. 4 members of the same family piled close together. Whatever little hope the men may have had that this was some strange misunderstanding disappeared immediately. But there should have been 6 people at Hinterkaifeck. Maria was missing, and so was Joseph. That meant they had to go inside the house. What happened next would become one of the most argued over moments in the entire case. Lorenz Schlittenbauer made his way into the residence. Inside, they found Maria dead in her room. And then they found Joseph. The little boy was dead too. Now the full scale of what had happened became clear. This was not an accident. It was not a family suddenly leaving town. Someone had killed every person living at Hinterkaifeck. And almost immediately, the scene became chaotic. Neighbors came. Police had to travel in. People moved through the farm before anything resembling a modern crime scene could be secured. Objects were touched. Bodies were examined and moved. People even used parts of the house. By modern investigative standards, the scene was badly contaminated almost from the beginning. But even with all of that confusion, investigators began noticing details that made the case stranger instead of clearer. There was money in the house. There were valuables that had not been taken. So if this was a robbery, the robber had apparently left behind things worth stealing. The animals had been cared for. Food had been used. And whoever killed the family seemed to know his way around the property. Then there was something else. Remember the missing key Andreas had mentioned before the murders? Remember the noises in the attic? Remember the footprints that came from the forest toward Hinterkaifeck but seemed to have no matching trail going away? Those details had sounded creepy before. Now they sounded like warnings. Because investigators were forced to consider a possibility that was almost impossible to believe. The killer may have come to Hinterkaifeck before March 31st. He may have watched the family. He may have hidden somewhere on the property. Then he killed 6 people. And instead of escaping immediately afterward, he may have remained there for days. While a salesman knocked at the door. While the postman delivered mail. While a mechanic worked outside for hours. While neighbors passed nearby. The murderer may have been inside the farmhouse, feeding the cattle, eating the family's food, and waiting. And if that was true, then the biggest question was no longer just who had killed the Gruber family. It was this. What kind of person could murder 6 people, including 2 children, and then feel comfortable enough to stay in their home? Police would soon begin looking for that person. And almost immediately, attention turned toward a man who knew the farm extremely well. A man who knew Victoria. A man who had argued with the family. A man who had once believed little Joseph might be his son. And, most strangely of all, a man whose behavior while discovering the bodies would leave people wondering about him for the next 100 years. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. By the afternoon of April 4th, the people living around Hinterkaifeck had reached the point where maybe they're just busy no longer felt like a good explanation. Lorenz Schlittenbauer was one of the neighbors who decided to go over and check. Along with 2 other men, Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel, he crossed the fields toward the farm, expecting, at least in the best-case scenario, to find somebody sick, injured, or dealing with some kind of emergency. Nothing moved when they arrived. Instead, the place had that strange, wrong kind of quiet you notice when somewhere that should be busy suddenly isn't. Cattle were still in the barn, doors were shut, and the family that normally worked the property had simply vanished. Eventually, the 3 men made their way toward the barn. There, under hay and debris, they found what everyone had been missing for 4 days. Andreas Gruber was dead. Beside him lay his wife, Cecilia. Nearby were Victoria and 7-year-old Cecilia. 4 bodies were crowded into the same part of the barn, and once the men saw them, there was no longer any question that something terrible had happened. Still, 2 people were missing. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, should have been somewhere on the property. Little Joseph should have been there too, so the search moved toward the house. Here is where Lorenz Schlittenbauer's behavior starts becoming important. According to the other men, Lorenz did not simply stand outside waiting for police. Rather, he entered the living portion of the farmhouse and continued searching. Inside, Maria was found dead in her room. Then Joseph was discovered in his bed. Now all 6 people at Hinterkaifeck were accounted for. Everyone was dead. Police were summoned, neighbors gathered, and the farm quickly became a crime scene filled with people who did not understand how much evidence they were touching, moving, or walking over. Modern investigators would seal the place off immediately. Back then, people moved through rooms, handled objects, and stood around the bodies. That contamination would haunt the investigation. But even before detectives could properly organize what they were looking at, Lorenz was already attracting attention. Part of the reason was obvious. He had not been just another neighbor. Years earlier, Lorenz and Victoria Gabriel had been romantically involved. Their relationship became serious enough that marriage had been discussed, and when Victoria gave birth to Joseph in 1919, Lorenz became publicly connected to the question of the boy's father. At one point, he acknowledged paternity. Later, things became much more complicated. Remember what we talked about earlier? Victoria and her father, Andreas, had previously been convicted over an incestuous relationship. Because of that history, some people wondered whether Joseph might actually have been Andreas's child. Imagine what that possibility could have done to Lorenz. Maybe he believed Joseph was his and felt tied to Victoria. Perhaps he thought he had been deceived and humiliated. Either way, his relationship with the Gruber family had become tangled in sex, money, paternity, and resentment. There had been arguments. Marriage plans had fallen apart. Financial obligations had been disputed. None of that proves murder. Plenty of people have ugly relationships and never hurt anyone. Yet when an entire household is found dead, police naturally look closely at people who had motive, access, knowledge of the victims, and familiarity with the property. Lorenz checked several of those boxes. Another detail made people even more uncomfortable. Before the murders, Andreas had reportedly said that a house key had gone missing. After the bodies were discovered, Lorenz was able to get into the residence. That fact became one of the most repeated pieces of the Hinterkaifeck mystery. Some later versions make the sequence sound almost conclusive. Andreas loses a key, Lorenz enters the house, therefore Lorenz must have had the missing key. Reality is not nearly that clean. Accounts differ over which doors were locked, exactly how Lorenz entered, and whether the missing key had anything to do with his access. Even so, imagine standing there in 1922 and hearing the story for the first time. A farmer says someone has been walking around his property. Soon afterward, a key disappears. Days later, that farmer and his entire household are murdered. Then the former boyfriend of his daughter, someone with a personal history of conflict with the family, is moving through the farmhouse after helping discover the bodies. You would remember that. Witnesses also described parts of Lorenz's behavior as strange. He reportedly moved through the property with a confidence the other men found unsettling. At times, he was separated from them. According to later testimony, he disturbed hay or the position of the victims while trying to identify the bodies. Again, there are innocent explanations for all of this. Shock does strange things to people. If you believe somebody you know might still be alive inside a farmhouse, you search. When one of the dead people is your former partner, and one of the children may be your son, there is no normal way to behave. However, there was another interpretation. What if Lorenz was not confused by the scene? Maybe he already knew his way through it. That possibility became even harder to ignore because the killer seemed unusually comfortable at Hinterkaifeck. Whoever committed the murders appears to have controlled the household without setting off a chaotic escape. Someone also seems to have known how to care for the livestock afterward. That same person could apparently move through the rooms, find food, use the farm, and remain there without immediately drawing attention. A stranger could have figured those things out. Lorenz would not have needed to. Then there was Joseph. If Lorenz believed the boy was his son, killing a 2-year-old would seem almost impossible to reconcile. On the other hand, if he believed Joseph was actually Andreas's child, the boy could have represented the most painful part of the entire dispute. That theory is grim, and it remains only a theory. Still, detectives investigating 6 murders have to ask questions that are uncomfortable. Money created another problem with the stranger theory. Cash and valuables remained at the farmhouse. That made a simple robbery harder to accept. Meanwhile, the killer's behavior felt strangely personal. 4 members of the Gruber family had been attacked in the barn. 2 more people were killed inside the house. Afterward, somebody may have stayed on the property, eaten their food, and cared for their animals. Those are difficult actions to explain if the murderer was a terrified burglar who just wanted to escape. By contrast, Lorenz knew the family. Unlike a random traveler, he knew the farm. Years of history connected him to Victoria. Paternity connected him to Joseph. His home was nearby. Most importantly, he was one of the first people to enter the murder scene. For a moment, when you stack those details together, the mystery starts to feel almost solved. You can picture the theory people around Hinterkaifeck would eventually whisper to one another. Maybe Lorenz still had access to the house. Perhaps he came to confront Victoria or Andreas. Something went wrong. Then one killing became several. After that, Maria and Joseph could not be left behind. Finally, because he knew the property, he could move around without looking lost, care for the animals, and wait until enough time had passed to distance himself from the murders. It sounds frighteningly plausible. Except suspicion is not proof. No witness saw Lorenz kill anyone. Police never produced a clean piece of physical evidence placing the murder weapon in his hands. Even the key story, as suspicious as it sounds, could not be established as neatly as later retellings often suggest. But none of that stopped people from watching him. For years afterward, neighbors argued about the way Lorenz had behaved that afternoon. Rumors followed him through the community. Some became convinced that the man who walked into Hinterkaifeck on April 4th knew far more than he admitted. And once you hear the whole case from their point of view, it is easy to understand why. He knew Victoria. Resentment may have given him a reason to hate Andreas. Joseph tied him directly to the family's most painful secret. Familiarity meant he knew the layout of the farm. A key had vanished before the killings. Then, when 6 bodies were finally discovered, Lorenz moved through the property as if he knew where he was going. Maybe every one of those things has an innocent explanation. Or maybe the man who opened the farmhouse that afternoon was not seeing the murder scene for the first time. Maybe he was coming back to it. For the next several years, investigators kept coming back to the same problem. Almost every theory about Hinterkaifeck explained one part of the crime, but none of them explained all of it. Lorenz Schlittenbauer remained the most obvious name. On paper, he had almost everything detectives would want to examine. He knew the farm. His relationship with Victoria had ended badly. Questions about Joseph's paternity connected him directly to one of the family's deepest secrets. Witnesses thought parts of his behavior when the bodies were discovered were strange. Then there was the missing key. Put all of that together, and Lorenz looks like the answer. Except once you start asking for actual proof, the case against him gets much weaker. No one saw him at Hinterkaifeck on the night of March 31st. Investigators never found the victim's blood on his clothing, never produced a reliable confession, and never uncovered physical evidence proving that the missing key had ended up in his possession. Even the famous story about Lorenz somehow unlocking a door that nobody else could open becomes less certain when you look closely at the surviving accounts. Because witnesses did not always agree on exactly which doors were locked or how people entered the house. Suspicion followed him anyway. Neighbors whispered about him for years. Lorenz became so tired of being called a murderer that he took legal action against people who publicly accused him, and he was never convicted of the killings. So maybe he really was innocent. If he was, though, you still need someone else. The simplest alternative would be robbery. A stranger comes across an isolated farm, believes there is money inside, attacks the family, searches the house, and leaves. At first, that sounds reasonable. Then you remember what police found. Cash was still there. Valuables remained behind. Whoever killed 6 people had taken an enormous risk, yet apparently ignored property a robber should have wanted. That does not make robbery impossible. Maybe the killer was interrupted. Perhaps he could not find what he expected. Possibly money was taken, and investigators simply could not know exactly how much had been there before the murders. Still, robbery does not explain the strangest part very well. Why feed the cattle? Why eat food from the kitchen? Why remain around the farm after everyone was dead? A burglar wants distance. The person at Hinterkaifeck seemed to have time. Another theory pointed to traveling criminals, vagrants, or strangers moving through the countryside after World War I. Germany in the early 1920s was unstable. Men had returned from war, traumatized, communities were struggling economically, and people moved from place to place looking for work or food. An isolated farm could have looked like an easy target. That idea also gives us a possible explanation for the newspaper from Munich and the footprints coming from the forest. Maybe someone unknown really did walk onto the property. But again, the behavior after the murders becomes difficult to understand. A drifter unfamiliar with Hinterkaifeck would have had to control 6 people, navigate a connected farmhouse and barn in darkness, know enough about the livestock to care for them, find food, stay hidden when visitors approached, and then disappear without being seen. Possible? Absolutely. Comfortable? That is harder to believe. Police also looked at men who had worked at Hinterkaifeck or knew the family through farm labor. That makes sense because a former worker could explain something a random stranger cannot. He would know the layout. He might understand Andreas's routine. He could know where tools were stored, how doors worked, and where someone could hide. Maybe he even had a grudge. Over the decades, several former workers and local men were suggested as suspects, often because somebody remembered an argument, a threat, or strange behavior. Yet none of those leads produced enough evidence to solve the case. Time made things worse. Witnesses died. Memories changed. Stories that began as, "Someone said he heard this," gradually became, "This definitely happened." That is why you have to be careful with Hinterkaifeck. Some of the most famous details are stronger than others. The family was murdered. That is certain. 4 victims were found in the barn area, while Maria and Joseph were found inside the house. That is certain. Money and valuables remained at the property. That is well documented. The livestock appear to have been cared for after the murders, and signs suggested someone had continued using the farm. That is one of the central facts behind the belief that the killer remained nearby. Other details are less solid. Stories about exactly how much food the murderer ate, exactly where he slept, whether he calmly lived there for every hour of the next 4 days, or whether he watched each visitor from a hidden window, are things we cannot know. Nobody saw him doing those things. Likewise, the idea that the killer had been secretly living in the attic for days before the murders is not established fact. It is a possibility created by Andreas's reports of strange noises and the unexplained activity around the property. And that distinction matters, because Hinterkaifeck does not need embellishment. The facts are already bad enough. There was also another theory, one that grew partly from the family's own history. Maybe this was personal, not robbery. Not a random traveler. Revenge. Andreas had enemies. His relationship with Victoria had caused scandal. The family had been involved in disputes, and Joseph's paternity had created tension that reached outside the household. Someone with a deeply personal grievance could explain why the killer did not stop after one victim. Perhaps the goal was not to steal anything. Maybe the goal was to erase the entire family. That could even explain Maria. She may simply have arrived at the worst possible moment. If the killer intended to leave no witnesses, then a maid who had been at Hinterkaifeck for only a few hours would die for no reason other than being there. Little Joseph is harder. Whatever theory you choose has to explain why a 2-year-old boy had to be killed. And once you reach that question, almost every neat explanation falls apart. A robbery does not require it. An argument does not require it. Even revenge against Andreas does not automatically require murdering a toddler. Whoever entered Joseph's room made a separate choice. That person wanted nobody left alive. Eventually, the investigation went cold. The murder weapon believed to have been used, a heavy farm implement, was found later during the dismantling of the property, hidden in a place investigators had apparently missed during the original search. By then, the crime scene had already been compromised beyond anything modern detectives would tolerate. Hinterkaifeck itself did not last. The farm was torn down. Buildings disappeared. Fields changed. The people who knew the Grubers grew old and died. What remained was a file full of interviews, contradictions, rumors, suspects, and 6 people who never got an answer. More than a century later, Lorenz can still be made to look guilty. A stranger can still be made to fit. A revenge killing can still be made to fit. A revenge killing can still be made to fit. But every theory requires you to explain away something. That is why I keep coming back to the beginning. Before anybody knew Hinterkaifeck would become a murder scene, Andreas Gruber was already frightened by something. He found footprints coming from the forest toward his home. According to his account, he could not find a matching trail leading back out. Later, A newspaper appeared that no one in the household recognized. Then a key went missing. After that came the sounds above the ceiling. Footsteps. Not once in the middle of the murders. Before them. Andreas went up to investigate. He searched. Nobody was there. Maybe every one of those things had an innocent explanation. Snow melts unevenly. Newspapers get carried around. Keys disappear. Old buildings make noises. That is the comforting answer. The other answer is that the Gruber family received a series of warnings and simply did not understand what they meant. Because if those footprints really belonged to the killer, then he may have reached Hinterkaifeck days before the murders. If the missing key was taken by that same person, then he may already have had a way into the house. And if Andreas really was hearing a human being walking across the attic floor while his family slept below, then the most frightening question in the entire Hinterkaifeck case is not who came to the farm on March 31st. It is this. If the person Andreas heard in the attic was already living inside Hinterkaifeck, how long had the killer been above their heads? Thanks so much for watching, and let me know in the comments who you think was really behind the Hinterkaifeck murders. Drop your theory below, because this is one of those cases where every explanation seems to leave one disturbing detail behind. Remember, there are plenty more strange and unexplained true stories waiting for you, so go ahead and check out the next one. Until then, keep an eye on the attic. See ya.